doing this production as well as teaching is walking and chewing gum for me. So uh, here we go. I hope all of you can say amen to such matters as that. Again, welcome to all of you. Kevin, glad to have you here with us. Wesley. Today we're dealing with a question that for Christians who are in the very least reflective is one that challenges us to the depths of our being. And that is actually it's several facets to it, as Cone describes it here in chapter 4, the questions of evil, suffering, death, and sin, which are dealt with in kind of a package deal, as it were. And as I said, if you're at all the least bit of reflective, I suspect you have had to encounter this at some level of your consciousness. And it's interesting the way Jim Cone goes about talking about it as well. It's interesting. He starts out early on talking about God and Black suffering. And he makes a really interesting point, one that would be really interesting for a few of us academics. That is a philosophical discussion. Some of us would really get into that, and others, about the third sentence in, would start rolling their eyes. So we're not going to do that kind of thing right now. And indeed, there are all questions about how and how well we could do that in any case. But he does want to talk about uh, the concrete uh, question in the context, as he puts it on page 54, the context of the community of faith, and beginning with the assumption, as he says a little bit later down in that paragraph, the biblical view of God's activity. There are several aspects here that I wanted to address because um, there's a whole lot of things going on. This is a puzzle with many parts, moving parts as well. One of the things he mentions is the approach to evil and suffering that one witnesses, particularly in the Old Testament books of Job, Ecclesiastes, the Psalms, and in the prophet Habakkuk. Although my Hebrew teacher told me in Hebrew it's pronounced Habakkuk, but we won't worry about that right now. Um, um, and indeed, in some respects, they do seem to be responding to what has sometimes been called and he refers to it as the Deuteronomic doctrine. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, both literally and metaphorically, the Deuteronomic doctrine that he talks about is predicated or grounded in a certain approach to questions of culpability, sin, evil, and the like, that one finds initially addressed in the order of the Old Testament books as they appear. The fifth book of the law, or the Torah, the Deuteronomy, and then in the history of Israel from Judges, Joshua and Judges through Second Kings, sometimes called the Deuteronomistic history. But perhaps the most concise expression of what has sometimes been labeled the Deuteronomic doctrine is here in Deuteronomy chapter 30, beginning at verse 15. Moses is addressing the people just prior to their entry into the promised land. And he says to them, "See, I've set you before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Now, what's really interesting in terms of this this approach, this commandment, as it were, this context to the commandments, is that this is something addressed specifically to Israel. But it has been taken, and down through the centuries, many people, many churches, many groups have taken this as a kind of formula for deciding who is righteous and who's not, why you are suffering, you must have done something wrong, which in the biblical context is definitely not the case. Um, but there's also another aspect here, because I've, starting in seminary through graduate school and at Baylor, I've heard people rail against the Deuteronomic doctrine, as they refer to it. It's actually not a doctrine. It's part of Israel's history and teaching. Um, but I always want to say to them, uh, you don't want to throw this out completely because the word will become completely unintelligible. We'd like to think, and that we have I think, a kind of intuition that there is some kind of relationship between one's life of faithfulness to God and how it ultimately comes out for one. Not immediately and not uh, as a kind of formula, but so I want to avoid the two extremes, that this becomes a formula for judging why some people prosper and some people suffer, while to judge some people they must be righteous and others they must be wicked. So uh, this is something that I do want to talk about. Have you ever encountered people, churches, groups who have tried to use this passage and viewpoint out Deuteronomy in that kind of way?
My
No,
brother used to,
he did. What?
and maybe still does. He was a lay preacher and
Uh-huh.
missionary in in Indonesia for some time.
Okay. I mean, one can find um, uh, resemblance to this in many cultures of the world, in the kind of westernized understanding of karma, for example, and those kinds of things. So um, it is, by the way, it's not limited to Deuteronomy in the history influenced by that book of the law. Even the passage that so many of us are drawn to, the passage at the end of Matthew 25, when the Son of Man comes to judge the world, he divides the groups into two groups: those who are blessed, and then those who are cursed. So it's interesting. This is not an isolated viewpoint. There is a thread of this running throughout Scripture. Um, the
Yeah,
idea that God does judge the wicked and reward the righteous in some respect.
I was just gonna say, I don't think I've seen this particular passage appealed to as much, but just thinking about, when I've encountered prosperity gospel teachings and that kind of thing, it's like if you are blessed, that's a sign of like God's love, as opposed to, oh, you just didn't have enough faith, which is, maybe aligned with this, even if it's not a direct appeal.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are not aware of the kind of, if you will, genealogy of that kind of thinking. Uh, uh, but there is that kind of connection as well. One of the things I wanted to point to and talk about just a little bit is um, how does Scripture view it? Um, it's interesting when one approaches the question of evil and asks questions like, um, why is there evil? Why does God permit evil? And the like. Scripture never takes that standpoint. By the way, it's an interesting standpoint to think about this theoretically. And indeed, one of the things I might point to here is that in the book of Job, there is perhaps a strong impetus not to look at it that way. Let me share the screen again. And yeah, here we go. For those of you who remember the book of Job, and as Jim Cohn reminds us, Job is a righteous man. Uh, he honors God, he honors the poor, he does not sin, and um, uh, indeed, he not only offers sacrifice for his own shortcomings, but he does it for his children as well. And yet, God, following the admonition or the urging of the accuser, which is the ultimate Persian root of the word Satan or Satan, um, allows for Job to be persecuted, to lose all that he has, and to suffer in his body miserable sores. And then he's joined by his friends, and for a while, his friends do the exact right thing. They they sit with him. They don't say anything. It's when they open their mouths that the problems begin. But ultimately, um, Job proclaims his righteousness and as it were, kind of shakes his fist at God and demands, "What's going on here? Show me where I've done wrong." And so in chapter 38 of Job, God finally answers. The Lord answers Job out of the whirlwind. And uh, if you will, what is offered here is not a theoretical explanation of why God permits evil or why is there evil. Instead, God basically says, are you one to ask these questions? I love the start. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Up to this point, Job has been the one asking questions and demanding answers. And now God turns it around and says, I will pose the questions, and you shall declare to me. This might be my own little peculiar twist on the story, but I can imagine at this point Job swallowing hard, gulp. And then just the next passage. Where were you, God says to Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. This goes on, by the way, for several chapters. And ultimately, Job admits he has demanded knowledge of things that are far too wonderful for him. So it is interesting the way he approaches that. In the book of Psalms and in the prophet Habakkuk, a different approach is taken. If you have your text, turn, if you will, in chapter 4. In the very first section on faith and suffering in the Bible, he quotes, this is in the print edition on the bottom page 54 to the top of 55. The questions that Habakkuk and the Psalms ask is not the theoretical question, why is there evil? What purpose does evil serve? Why does God permit evil? It's basically, what's going on here, Lord? So I read, again, this is the words of the prophet. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and thou wilt not hear? Or cry to violence, and thou wilt not save? Why dost thou make me see wrongs and look upon trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is slacked, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. He talks a little bit about the historical context in the next paragraph, that the Babylonians or the Chaldeans are being roused by God to punish the Assyrians, because ultimately the issue, as he says, is justice. How can the Holy One of Israel justify the use of wicked and faithless men as instruments of divine righteousness? And he actually says that. Thou art of pure eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on wrong. Why dost thou look on faithless men, and art silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? And you can see how, I think, that how slaves in their condition, who don't start from the idea that we can rise ourselves up and think like God thinks and judge God on the basis some measure of evil, but rather start from the position of faith. He mentions that, by the way. on page 56. This is towards the end of this first section on faith and suffering in the Bible. Um, First full paragraph, top page 56, a few lines down. Neither Job nor Habakkuk questioned the ultimate sovereignty of God. What was requested was a divine explanation of God's righteousness and history so that the faithful could understand the way of the Almighty. The answer comes in encounter with God. And then there's a quotation from Habakkuk. The Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain upon tablets so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its time, it hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, he whose soul is not upright in him shall fail, but the righteous shall live by his faith. And if that sounds a little bit familiar, that was one of the Apostle Paul's go-to passages out of the Old Testament. So it's interesting here, and as we get into some of these slave spirituals, these kinds of matters will keep coming up. How do you respond to these kinds of biblical passages? By the way, there are countless numbers of Psalms we could refer to and see much the same thing. Laments or questioning of God. What are you up to, God? What are you doing? And yet, in the end, it's always a waiting upon God.
It feels very familiar to me. I mean, my life is blessed and not hard in many ways, but I still find myself wondering these things quite often.
Like I said, any Christian who is in the least bit reflective, I think, cannot help but have these kinds of questions come to them. Anyone else?
I guess I would comment in this way that I can see a distinction between raising these questions theoretically and raising them practically, but it's not a fine distinction. I mean, when one finds yourself or someone else with whom you identify suffering, and you believe, as we do, in a God who's ultimately in charge of everything, it's natural to ask, how does this fit together? So the theoretical question is it consistent to think of a God who's perfect in knowledge, power, and goodness? Is it consistent to believe that while recognizing that there are instances of horrific evil? How does that fit together?
Yeah, no, very good. I mean, and again, the question for those, the response to those kind of questions, particularly in the way Jim Cone is dealing with the spirituals on these matters, but I have a sympathy with it, is where you stand when you're asking these questions. Are you able, one of my elder colleagues who was very helpful in helping me see this, is it possible to obtain, if you will, a place in which God and the question of evil, the reality of evil, become comprehensible to us? In other words, is the way we typically approach the theoretical question, even within our purview. I'm just going back now to Ecclesiastes. One of the, you all remember the 60s song, There's a Time for Everything Under Heaven? And right after that passage in Ecclesiastes, the preacher, as he's typically called in Hebrew, What gain have the workers from the toil? I have seen the busyness that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. So, if you will, there is an affirmation that the cosmos is not chaotic. There is something going on that makes it cohere. So he has made everything suitable for his time. Moreover, God has put a sense of past and future into the minds of humans. So we do have this sense of what has been and what will be and the connection to the present. But then he makes it, he draws a conclusion that is disconcerting to us. Let me read the whole thing again, just to make sure it's in context. He has made everything suitable for his time, God has. Moreover, God has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Talk about a downer. We have this sense of past and future and this faith that God orders everything, but we can't figure out what we want, what it is. Some people, I guess, could call that a cosmic trick. Scripture tends to call it as an importance of approaching these things from the point of view of faith. Well, shall we continue then? Okay, on page 54, I just wanted to point this out that Jim Cone says, and I think rightly, that to the Black slaves' reaction to their enslavement, to point out their reflections were not, in the classical sense, rational. They were not based on abstract and universal distinctions between good and evil, justice and injustice. The slave, dropped down a little bit, the Black slave's investigation of the absurdities of human existence was concrete, and it was done within the context of the community of faith. No attempt was made to transcend the faith of the people by assuming a universal stance common to all people. That's kind of what I've been getting at there. What are human beings in our present state capable of attaining a stance whereby we could ask those questions? And so if we go on over in the next section, Black Faith and Suffering, in the print edition, it begins on page 57. Cone writes, in the spirituals, the Black slaves' experience of suffering and despair defined for them the major issue in their world, in their view of the world. They do not really question the justice and goodness of God. It was taken for granted that God is righteous and will vindicate the poor and the weak. Indeed, it was the point of departure for faith. The singers of the spirituals had another concern, centered on the faithfulness of the community of believers in a world full of trouble. They wondered not whether God is just and right, but whether the sadness and pain of the world would cause them to lose faith in the gospel of God. They were concerned with the solidarity of community of sufferers. And as he says there at the bottom of the page, they appealed to Jesus not so much to remove the trouble, though that was included, but to keep them from sinking down, to surrendering themselves to despair. And I think that's an interesting way of putting it that's important. Much of the music of the time of these questions deals with death, but they deal with it in a kind of interesting way. Give me a second to do some of my, yeah, here we go. Here's a spiritual, now this is probably one of the best examples of what it really means to hear and experience a Black spiritual. It's in what I assume a rural African-American church a few years ago, singing the song about the same train. And so I'll play it for you now.
Same train.
there's something very captivating about that church's performance. Performance is the wrong word. Celebration of that spiritual. It is liturgical. It is the work of the people, and it's getting caught up in something. And so this is essential, I think, to a point that Cone makes. And I'd be interested in how you think about it. If you will, one of the points that he makes in this chapter begins on page 58. Again, this is in the section on Black faith and suffering, for those of you who have the Kindle edition. Right after the passage that says, "All of my troubles will soon be over with," he says, "It appears that the slaves were not troubled by the problem of evil in its academic guise. They knew intuitively that nothing would be solved through a debate on that problem." Whether or not ultimately, by the way, that's correct or not, it has proved to be true to this point in time. The debate has not been solved. Continuing to read, "They dealt with the world as it was, not as it might have been if God had acted justly. They attended to the present realities of despair and loneliness that disrupted the community of faith. The faithful seem to have lost faith, and the brother or sister experiencing the agony of being alone in a world of hardship." And he then mentions a stanza from one of the spirituals. "I couldn't hear nobody pray. Oh, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Oh, way down yonder by myself, and I couldn't hear nobody pray." Thus, it is the loss of community that constitutes the major burden. Suffering is not too much to bear if there are brothers and sisters to go down in the valley to pray with you. And then he mentions the lyrics to Brothers Let's Go Down, made famous by the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? But you can see the different context here. For a group of people suffering some of the most cruel and inhuman treatment known in human history, finds ability to endure it as they gather in community together. And then he makes an interesting comment, and this is interesting here. On page 60, he says, again, this is a few paragraphs further on, "Despite the brokenness of community and family inflicted by slavery, slaves continue to hold on doggedly to what life and existence they had. The affirmation of life as expressed in their strivings for being was possible because they believed that they were sheltered in the care of the Lord. They remembered the Exodus, the covenant, the prophets, and most of all, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection." What does that mean? Because that's a powerful phrase that occurs more than a few times in Scripture. What does it mean in that context to remember? I mean, we know the kind of common sense, everyday use of that term. I remember what I had for dinner last night, but I don't think that quite covers it here. What does it mean to remember?
It makes connections.
Say more.
It connects the past, connects the Israelites and Jesus with their own plight, the parallels, excuse me, the parallel they see in it, similar experiences, and so it applies history to their context, their present.
Very good.
I think it means not just remembering with their heads, but with their hearts and emotions and
Okay.
spirit. So sometimes, like at present, we're very, very mindful of the Franklins with Joyce being so ill.
Yes.
And, you know, so I'm not just remembering in my head about her, but my heart's aching every hour for her, you know. And
No doubt. Whatever else one wants to say about this kind of practical standpoint that Cone describes, dealing with the world as they know it, the affections are part of that powerful remembering.
and that guides your behavior for the day. You know, it's sort of, you know.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, as often when dealing with the African American spirituals, the story of the Exodus should always remain front and center. Okay, hopefully you're familiar with the story, how it begins. That a new king arose in Israel after the time of Joseph that knew not Joseph, and the children of Israel became slaves. There was the command on the part of the king of Israel, Egypt, the Pharaoh, to kill the boys. Moses is saved by his mother by being floated in a basket. He's taken into Pharaoh's household. And then there's this interesting passage at the end of chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Just right there, you can understand why slaves in the antebellum South would have gravitated this passage. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning. And then this next line. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What does it mean that God remembered the covenant there? What happens next in the story?
So that God took action. It's not just they're there and, you know, they've been going along century after century like this, but it's now, okay, it's time I have to do something.
Okay, as one of my teachers in seminary, when God remembers, God's about to take names and kick you know what. And so that's a powerful one. To remember is to act on the basis of what has been. By the way, there's a little bit of a tweak here that's possible. There's a line of New Testament scholarship, Kevin could probably speak to this much better than I, that takes the words of the Lord's Supper, do this in remembrance of me, and has noticed that this was a phrase that one often sees in first century Jerusalem inscribed on sarcophagi. And the sense of it is, remember me, O Lord, in much the same way that, so the sense to say, or to hear the words of Jesus, do this in remembrance of me, is less an admonition for us to remember Jesus. Certainly that's not absent, but it's an appeal to God. Remember what your son has done. Remember his sacrifice. And on that basis, deal with us, O Lord. And while I am quite sure the slaves never had that understanding, I think it's something involved there. To remember Jesus is to appeal to God to act on the basis of who he is and what he has done for us. And again, the one of the important things here is, as we've noticed, suffering was not too much to bear, provided there are brothers and sisters to go into the valley with you. Let me at this point play one more song. This is one that he mentions, that Cone mentions on page, should have that ready. Well, I'll find it. Here we go. Like I said, I'm lousy at producing as well as teaching. Here we go. I'll get this yet. You all are very kind to wait on my ineptness. Mississippi John.
That's right. You got to walk that lonesome valley. Well, you got to walk it for yourself. Ain't nobody here can walk it for you. You got to walk the Red Valley for yourself. My mother had to walk that lonesome valley. Well, she had to walk it for herself. There's nobody here could walk it for her. Yeah, she had to walk the Red Valley for herself. Oh yeah, she got to walk that lonesome valley. Well, you got to walk it for yourself. There's nobody here can walk it for you. You got to walk. My father had to walk that lonesome valley. He had to walk it for himself. There's nobody here can walk it for him. He had to walk. Oh, Jesus had to walk that lonesome valley. He had to walk it for himself. There's nobody here could walk it for him. He had to walk the Red Valley for himself. Oh yes, you got to walk that lonesome valley. Well, you got to walk it for yourself. It's nobody here can walk it for you. You got to walk the Red Valley for yourself.
I can't help it.
Again,
I can see
forgive me.
what is
There we are, back again. I'm always kind of worried about what advertisement comes at the end of these examples here. Yeah, okay. Someone's got the spirit. Way to go. Way to go, little guy. What's really interesting there is suffering and death were acknowledged in very personal terms, but not in, one might say, a kind of modern 19th century existentialist isolated terms. On page 61 in the text, this comes right after the words for the spiritual that was just sung by Johnny. The paragraph reads, "It is commonplace among many interpreters of Black religion to account for the emphasis of the I in the spirituals. And some point to white pietism and revivalism, of which I suspect many of us are familiar. But he says that's too simplistic. Rather, the Black slaves invested scriptural language with the meaning was consistent with their struggle to affirm themselves as people, their identity and their freedom. The I in Black religion did not have its content the religious individualism and guilt of white religion, or refer to personal conversion in those terms. Nor was it simply a Black duplication of the idea of priesthood of all believers. The I of Black slavery religion was born in the context of the brokenness of Black existence. It was an affirmation of self in a situation where the decision to be was thrust upon the slaves. But the slaves did not determine the historical setting in which they had to make this affirmation. It had been determined by others against them. And so he goes on and says, the Black I then, who cries out in the spirituals, is a particular Black self, affirming both his or her being and being in community, for the two are inseparable. And it's inseparable not only with suffering, but in death. And we'll make this the final point here. If you turn over to the section that begins on page 67, where he talks about the meaning of death, on the bottom of page 68, death was not an abstract idea or an unknown force. Contact with the dead was immediate, inescapable, and dramatic. Particularly for slaves, but in the 18th, 19th century, all people had contact with death in ways that we really don't right now. One of the most interesting things one could talk about in this regard is the way we in the 21st century try to hide ourselves away from death, suffering, and the like. Death was spoken of in personal terms, he says. Death was a little old man who came tipping in the room, a man going around taking names, and a robber. On the next page, page 69, there's this hymn that the church that I played a few minutes ago was singing. Same train, carry my mother, carry my sister, and at some point would come for me as well. And then the point, and this is going into Lent and heading towards the Easter season, is very important. On the bottom of 69, he writes, Blacks accepted the inevitability of death. They knew that the train was a-coming and that the train was going to lay his cold, icy hands on them. But because of Jesus' death and resurrection, Black slaves did not believe that death was ultimate. It was inevitable and perhaps a dreadful experience, but it did not have the last word, which, by the way, ultimately, I would argue is the fundamental meaning of Easter. Death does not have the final word. And so they go on and say, just before the end of this section, Black people only made the request that they be allowed to die like Jesus died. In other words, this is part of their remembering to God that their death would be the death of Jesus, which, interestingly enough, is the Apostle Paul's message as well, to die the death of Jesus, to die in Jesus. We're about out of time in my daylight saving times adjusted clock here. Does anyone else have final comments or questions to ask? Like I said, there's all kinds of really interesting stuff, important stuff, troubling stuff around the questions of evil and suffering and death and Satan. I wish we had time, we could have looked at his passage on Satan because there was a lot of interesting stuff there, but again, we were limited in time. No? Well, then I do believe.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Monty?
I'm just thinking how amazing it is But presumably, when these people left Africa, they did not have Christian religion. How profoundly they learnt and absorbed and evaluated it themselves. There's some theological gems in all of that evolution of religion.
They did gravitate to that. I have learned recently that towards the end of the slave trade from Africa, there were a fairly large number of Catholic Africans brought to the South. It's something that is part of the story that's not often told. And so there was that mixture as well, and an enculturated Christianity as well. But in a very real sense, I would say, and I think Cohn would argue this, the people stolen from Africa and forced into slavery latched on to the fundamental sense of the gospel in ways that a lot of white people did not. And I think that's part of the impetus of this text. All right, no one wants the final word? That's always the way it is. I think we're meeting outdoors today, are we not? Does anyone, I didn't see any emails to the contrary. So hopefully I'll see some of you, and the rest of you have a good week then. God bless.
Thank you, Barry.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.